Ash spun across the shattered plaza as the blood moon swelled, and Ava Monroe said, "Damien? Look at me." Damien Blackthorne did not turn, his coat snapping, while Lucien Voss smiled like a blade. The air cracked as sigils erupted, and cobbles lifted, and Ava tasted iron and thunder. Damien said, "Stay back," but his voice shook, and her ribs tightened around a breaking heart. Lucien said, "He walks with me or the city burns," and the wards roared scarlet, and glass wept from the windows. Ava stepped forward and thought of every joke Milo ever tossed to keep her brave, and none arrived. The moon pulsed, and the plaza painted everything in ruined wine. Eleanor Gray shouted from the arch, "Ava down," but Ava held stubborn as breath. Damien glanced back once, and the glance cruelly gentle, and Ava said, "I will find you." And the promise bled into the stones. Lucien touched Damien's branded wrist, and the brand answered like a bell. The shockwave hammered the square, and Ava hit grit and smoke, and the world bent around grief. Damien said, "Forgive me," and vanished into Lucien's storm. The blast slumped into echoes, and Eleanor Gray dragged Ava into a colonnade that smelled of wet ash and old prayers. And Ava said, "He let him take him," and the words scraped. Eleanor said, "He thinks it spares you," and her hands shook despite iron calm. The columns hummed with fading wards, and the moon bled through dust strips like stained glass. Ava reached for her pocket and found a charred token, a crescent etched with a name that cut, and she said, this was his. Eleanor stared and said, "It belonged to the first heir." And fear crept behind wisdom. Footsteps scuffed, and street sirens wailed, and the city moaned like a wound. Ava said, "He told me to stay back," and she tasted salt and smoke, and shame folded into fury. Eleanor said, "There is a prophecy, child," and the word child soothed and stabbed at once. The token warmed, and a faint line of runes brightened, pulsing with her pulse. Ava said, "Then tell me now," and thunder rolled like a promise. Silence fell hard, and Ava leaned against the cold pillar, while the night thinned into a cruel quiet, and she said, "He looked back," and the memory stung alive. Milo Park skidded in with skinned knuckles and said, "Hate to interrupt grief hour, but the plaza's on fire, and so is my courage." She laughed once, painful, and said, "Your timing is awful." And he softened. The memory rose anyway, bright and jagged, Damien turning, eyes full of apology and command. Ava said, "He was afraid for me," and Milo said, "He was afraid of you losing yourself." Sirens faded to a nervous hush, and the moon sulked behind smoke like a tired god. Ava rolled the token in her palm, and it throbbed to her heartbeat. Milo said, "We going after him or writing sonnets?" And she said, "Both if I must." He grinned, thin and loyal, and said, "Then I'll rhyme with danger." The stone under her boot felt like a vow forming. She said, "I will not let Lucien write our ending." The air snapped, and every fountain in the quarter stilled as red light climbed their waters, and Lucien's voice rolled through the city on sorcery that tasted like copper. Lucien said, "Kneel by dawn or choke on your own magic," and windows answered with trembling glass. Eleanor said, "Broadcast ritual," and lines of fear stitched across her mouth. Milo said, "I vote we skip kneeling," and tried to smile, and the smile broke. Ava felt the brand echo in her wrist like a phantom ache, and she said, "He bound Damien to me." Eleanor said, "To your pulse," and the words dropped like chain. The streets below glittered with people spilling and scattering, and sirens wove with prayer bells. Lucien said, "The air returns at my leave," and the moon flared. Ava said, "He thinks he holds our sky," and heat coiled in her chest. Eleanor said, "Then we cut his hand from it," and the lantern shook only once. The winds slackened as if the night had made its threat, and now waited, and Ava closed her eyes and counted the beats that were hers and his, and she said, "I choose him," and the choice steadied her bones. Eleanor said, "Then you choose war," and lifted her chin, and the years on her face looked like maps. Milo said, "I'll pack snacks and bad ideas," and Ava almost smiled. The token warmed again, and new runes woke, a trail of sparks across the crescent, and Ava said, "Show me where," and the rune path curled toward the catacomb. Far below, people gathered themselves and stood because standing is what remains. Ava said, "I am not a weapon unless I choose to be," and the words sounded like flint. Eleanor said, "We train at first light," and the lantern went out as if agreeing. Milo said, "First light is in 5 hours," and she said, "Then we start now." The blood moon tilted toward the horizon like an oath unfinished. Dawn limped toward the city while Eleanor spread vellum across a scorched table, and Ava said, "Tell me everything." Eleanor said, "Your line began before the crowns, and dust danced in angled light." The crescent token pulsed, and a sketch of constellations burned through the page. Eleanor said, "Your mother hid you among merchants," and the word mother rang like a bell with a crack. Ava touched the map and felt heat move up her wrist like a tide. Eleanor said, "You channel through feeling," and shame pricked because feeling had wrecked the plaza. Ava said, "Then I am dangerous," and Eleanor said, "Then you are necessary." Footsteps crossed the hall, and Milo set down coffee that smelled like courage, pretending to be normal. Ava said, "If love feeds the fire, what star do I follow?" And the map aligned to a red thread. Eleanor said, "Follow what you refuse to lose," and the thread pointed beneath the city. Ava closed her eyes and saw Damien's glance like a wound that refused to close. She said, "I will not lose him," and the thread brightened as if it heard. Training began in the ruined gymnasium where mirrors wore soot, and Eleanor said, "Anchor breath to pulse." Ava inhaled, and the token warmed, and sparks combed the air like fast fireflies. Milo said, "I brought water and poor decisions," and his grin tried to help. Eleanor said, "Name what you fear, and power will choose shape," and Ava hated how quickly an answer arrived. Ava said, "Losing him," and heat surged, and a ribbon of flame stitched from her palm to the floor. The flame crawled toward a chalk sigil and bloomed into a bright ring. Eleanor said, "Break it before it crowns," and sweat ran like confession. Ava snapped her hand and pulled the fire into a hard ember sphere. The sphere trembled, threw off sparks, then quieted like a tamed ache. Milo clapped once and said, 10 out of 10 for drama, and the sphere winked out. Ava said, "If love fuels me, can it also unmake me?" And Eleanor did not lie when she said, "Yes." A raven hit the sill like a shadow folded twice, and a band of rune thread glowed at its leg. And Ava said, "Damien." Eleanor cut the thread, and a letter unrolled with heat. Damien said, "If you love me, do not come," and ink bruised the page with restraint. Ava read the tight script aloud, and the room tilted because the voice lived in her bones. Damien said, "Lucian bound my pulse to yours, and despair set its teeth." Damien said, "I can bear pain if you stay safe," and Ava tasted copper. Milo said, "He knows you like a bad map," and then softer, "He knows you run toward fire." Eleanor said, "He buys time with his skin," and the truth poisoned and steadied. Ava said, "I am not a saint of safety," and heat climbed her throat. The letter ended with 5 words, "Forgive the cruelty of distance," and the ink smeared under her palm. She folded the page like an oath, and said, "I am coming anyway." They walked the cloister where vines tried to reclaim stone, and Milo kicked pebbles like punctuation, and Ava said, "If it costs my life, I pay." Milo said, "I hate that bargain," and his voice stayed light because he knew how to carry heavy. Bells clanged faintly, and laundry lines snapped with city wind like small flags of defiance. Ava said, "He once found me when I was lost in markets and lies," and the memory warmed and burned. Milo said, "I remember that alley," and his laugh haunted the edge of kindness. Ava said, "I learned to breathe again," and shame softened into resolve. A child chased a paper star across the walkway, and hope moved like a simple thing. Milo said, "If you fall, I fall messy in front of you," and she smiled despite grief. She said, "I will not throw my life like a coin," and he said, "Good, we are broke enough." She looked at the horizon where smoke had thinned and said, I choose love and the work it demands. Milo nodded because choosing was a skill. Evening cooled the rooftops when a figure stepped from a roofline shadow like a second sunset, and Celine Vale said, You are loud, Ava. Ava said, Name your side, and Celine smiled like smoke. Celine said, I prefer doors that open both ways, and her eyes caught the moon, and hid it. Eleanor moved to block the stare and said, Shapeshifter, and the word tasted of old warnings. Celine, said Lucian, digs at the brand, and the brand digs back, and the message felt like a knife with helpful manners. Ava said, Why help me? And Celine said, Because survival is beautiful. Milo said, So is honesty, try 2 ounces, and Celine laughed softly. Celine said, The catacombs breathe tonight, and the map you carry lies unless warmed by trust. Ava felt the token answer, with a small heat at the word trust. Celine said at moonrise, A gate will choose a name, and the wind picked up like gossip. Ava said, Then walk with us or move, and Celine blinked, then stepped aside, and nothing about the smile was safe. Night rained sparks over the factory outpost as Ava vaulted a chain fence, and Milo said, Subtlety is cancelled. Eleanor whispered, Words breathe in 4s and traced air that hummed wrong. Celine said, I can be a key, and her eyes skipped shapes. The gate glyphs pulsed, and Ava said, On my mark, and heat rose in her palms like a promise. The team surged, and alarms cried like metal gulls, and smoke climbed. Lucian's ward buckled, then snapped back with teeth, and pain rang through Ava's bones. A blur cut between shadows, and Rowan Hale said, Turn back, little star, and the nickname dragged blood from memory. Ava struck flame and said, You chose him, and the flame shattered against invisible glass. Rowan parried with cold wind that smelled of winter graves. Eleanor said retreat, but Ava stepped once more because love never learned math. Rowan's blade kissed the embosphere and spun it skyward. He said, Live long enough to hate me, and his eyes begged for something uglier. The wards roared, and the outpost sealed like a closing throat. They collided in a yard of rusted drums while sirens gnawed the dark, and Rowan said, I kept you alive once. Ava said, You sold me once, and the echo cut skin. Rain slicked his hair, and guilt made a home in his mouth. Rowan said, Lucian will gut the city to bait you, and the words sounded like chains. Ava said he already has me, and the brand throbbed like a drum. Rowan circled slow and said, You loved me when I was worth it, and memory flared warm, then ash. Milo shouted from the fence, Clock is chewing us, and fear wore his grin. Ava said, Tell me where Damien is, and Rowan laughed like a bruise. He said, In a room with no doors unless you break yourself to build one. Eleanor called, Ava, and the plea trembled. Rowan lowered the blade and said, Hate me later, breathe now, and wind pushed the rain sideways. Ava said, I will breathe when he does, and she turned from him because turning was harder than striking. They hid beneath a girder bridge where river fog braided with smoke. And Eleanor said, The prophecy isn't a lock, it's a mirror. Ava said, What do I see? And she already feared the answer. Eleanor unrolled notes scarred by years and said, At moonrise the heart must choose the blade or the band. Milo said, I choose pizza, and then quieter, I choose you two alive. Ava traced the ink and felt it vibrate like a plucked wire. Eleanor said, Love turns your magic fluent, but it charges interest. Ava said, It will take me or him, and the words weighed more than steel. Celine balanced on a beam and said, Or it takes both, and gives back a third thing. The river slapped pilings like a bad heartbeat. Ava said, I won't be a sacrifice offered by a story, and the token warmed as if in agreement. Eleanor said, Write a different ending, but know the cost, and her eyes looked older than the bridge. Morning gnawed at cloud edges when Milo pried open a crate and said, Treasure or tetanus? Inside lay a slab of star iron etched with constellations that shifted when no one blinked. Ava said, "It's a map that breathes," and the metal answered with a soft hum. Celine said, "Let me," and her hand slid like permission. The slab darkened, then brightened, and the lines bent toward the catacombs. Eleanor said, "Do not touch that bond line," and Celine smiled like a dare. In one breath, the slab was gone from Milo's hands and appeared at Celine's feet. Milo said, "You thief," and she said, "I borrow futures." Ava said, "Return it," and Celine tilted her head and blew on the iron. The constellations rewrote, revealing a narrow path hidden under a false turn. Celine placed the slab back and said, "Now you live 5 minutes longer." Milo muttered, "Our new favorite criminal," and the map cooled like a secret satisfied. As noon thinned to pale gold, Ava touched the bond line, and the world leaned. And she stood inside a room not hers. Damien Blackthorne said, "You stubborn miracle," and relief broke like rain inside heat. Chains of light tethered his wrists to a sigil wheel, and his eyes held storms and apologies. Ava said, "Say where you are," and the air crackled with distance. Damien said, "If you come, the brand takes the city," and love slammed the brakes and floored them together. She said, "I am learning to drive the fire," and the wheel shivered. Lucian's shadow slid along a wall like a patient tide. Damien said, "Promise me nothing brave," and a raw smile hurt his mouth. Ava said, "I promise to win," and the room shook with a small rebellion. The vision buckled, as if a hand pinched its throat. Damien said, "Forgive me," and the bond snapped back, leaving her in skylight with her pulse a drum. She said, "I heard enough," and the token burned like a path she would take. The catacombs breathed like a slow animal as damp air kissed stone, and Ava Monroe said, "If the map lies, we learn fast." Eleanor Gray said, "It tests conviction," and chalk dust ghosted her sleeve. Milo Park said, "My conviction is sweaty," and tried a grin that slipped. Celine Vale traced a seam and said, "Doors prefer secrets," and the seam shivered open. The corridor bloomed with mirrors that wore Ava's face, and each reflection flinched at different fears. Ava said, "I am not the girl who breaks when told," and the glass shuddered. One mirror showed Damien Blackthorne turning away, and her breath hooked on memory. Eleanor said, "Name your truth before it names you," and the torches crackled like teeth. Ava said, "I choose him and myself," and a path cleared with a brittle pop. A floor sigil lit under Milo's heel, and he froze as spikes whispered awake. Celine said, "Left foot, liar," and tugged him into narrow safety. Catacombs exhaled, and their courage felt borrowed and spent at once. They reached a ledge where black water swallowed torchlight, and Milo said, "I hate bottomless things." A rung snapped under him, and gravity cleared its throat like a bully. Rowan Hale rose from shadow and caught Milo's jacket with a curse. Ava said, "Let go or earn it," and her palm burned with barely leshed fire. Rowan said, "Debt claimed," and hauled Milo up with a grunt that tasted of regret. Milo said, "Next time bring stairs," and his laugh shook like a tired hinge. Celine said, "He bleeds guilt," and watched Rowan with hunter stillness. Rowan said, "Lucian waits 2 turns ahead," and the warning carried ash and memory. Ava said, "You chose him over me," and the echo rattled iron. Rowan said, "I chose you breathing," and the words limped. Eleanor said, "We move," and authority snapped the thread of grudges. The tunnel widened, and water clapped stone in slow applause as the ledge forgot to fall again. Far above the earth, a ritual chamber hummed like a hive, and Damien Blackthorne stood chained to light that learned his pulse. Lucian Voss said, "Your heart is a handle," and his smile wrote laws. Damien said, "You will choke on the cost," and the brand at his wrist flared pain. Lucian said, "Her heartbeat wins your leash," and his rings flashed with patient cruelty. The sigil wheel turned, and distant thunder stacked like debts unpaid. Damien saw Ava in memory, and he steadied on that fragile warmth. Lucian said, beg and I ease her burden, and the lie wore silk. Damien said, she is not yours to measure, and his voice scraped truth. The chains tightened when Ava's name rose, and the air tasted of iron. Lucian said, I only harvest what love grows, and the chamber brightened to a surgical red. Damien lifted his chin and said, you cannot farm a storm, and the wheel hissed as if stung. Somewhere Stone answered with a tremor. Am A side grotto yawned like a tired mouth, and Ava sat with her back to bone wall, and the quiet buzzed. Ava said, what if I am only tinder, and the confession felt small and heavy. Eleanor Gray sank beside her and said, I once burned a village to save a child, and ash crossed her gaze. Ava said, you never told me, and hurt flickered like a wet match. Eleanor said, I hid the cost so you could learn courage, not caution, and her hand steadied. Drips counted time that refused kindness. Milo kept watch at the mouth and said, we are still here, and the words fought for light. Celine leaned in shadow and said, power loves a price tag, and did not apologize. Eleanor said, you choose which debts you sign, and she pressed the crescent into Ava's palm. Ava said, I fear breaking what I love, and the token warmed like agreement. Eleanor said, forge it instead, and the torch flame answered with a taller spine. They reached an arch choked with thorns of iron runes, and the path chose its price. Celine said, this gate opens for a vow, and the thorns shifted like listening snakes. Milo said, please no blood keys, and flexed fingers that had held fear all night. Ava Monroe stepped forward and said, love isn't my weakness, it's my weapon, and the words rang. The thorns recoiled as if scalded by honesty that burned clean. Eleanor Gray said, name what you defend, and authority glowed soft. Ava said, I defend his life and mine, and heat rose in a halo from her skin. The arch unwound, revealing stairs that smelled of metal weather. Rowan Hale watched her with an expression that hurt to keep, and he said, be vicious for the right things. Celine smiled like a coin flipping and said, door approves. Milo exhaled a laugh that believed in afters. They stepped through together, and the catacombs nodded like an old judge satisfied. The stairs delivered them to a circular vault where the air hummed like a held chord, and Celine Vale said, listen with your blood. Ava Monroe felt the crescent answer, and heat braided with her pulse. Eleanor Gray said, careful, but the warning arrived late. Sigils rose from the floor as if the stone exhaled truth it had saved for famine. Celine said, you call it a curse, and her smile wavered, but it is a bond that keeps two hearts in one weather. Ava said survival, and the word tasted like rain after smoke. Milo Park said, define weather, and gulped because jokes need oxygen. Celine touched the circle, and crimson threads mapped a heartbeat that matched Ava's. Celine said, if one fades, the other empties, and silence hit like a wave. Ava whispered, he lives while I do, and fear walked hand in hand with relief. The vault ceiling reflected her face and Damien Blackthorn's outline, and the likeness broke her careful breath. Eleanor said, a tether is still a choice, and her voice asked for courage she believed existed. A second ring rose and showed an antlered crest, and Eleanor Gray muttered, sigil, as if the word might bite. Celine Vale said, Lucian Voss fears thrones, he cannot sit, and her fingers hovered above history. Ava Monroe said, Damien Blackthorn is the hidden heir, and the room answered with a low thunder. Milo Park said, so our brooding protector is also royalty, and tried on the title like a jacket that pinched. The sigil wheeled and revealed a door of light keyed to Ava's touch. Eleanor said, your bond is the key that wakes his lineage, and pride warred with dread. Ava said, he never told me, and love turned its face, ashamed and bright. Celine said, he has been told to die quietly for a crown he never wanted, and the honesty felt surgical. The crest dissolved into a map that ran up the tower like a vein. Ava said, we climb, and the circle brightened as if it liked decisive sentences. The vault shifted, and the path forward stopped pretending to be vague. They emerged into a gallery of broken saints, and Rowan Hale leaned against a cracked statue, and his eyes refused to settle. Ava Monroe said, "Tell me why you served him," and her voice sharpened. Rowan said, "Lucian Voss found me starved for purpose, and fed me a lie that looked like mercy." Milo Park said, "Mercy with knives and paste, because standing still felt like drowning." Rowan said, "He promised your safety if I brought him maps and hearts," and the confession shook loose dust. Ava said, "You loved me and still chose him, and the truth cut both directions." Rowan nodded and said, "I chose the road where you woke up every morning," and shame bridled his mouth. Eleanor Gray said, "Debt written in blood demands new ink," and age sat heavy on her posture. Rowan said, "Let me pay now," and set his sword down like a prayer that might be heard. Ava said, "Then walk with us until it hurts less," and the invitation stung. The gallery's windows sighed under wind like an organ searching for a hymn. A narrow study opened off the gallery, smelling of vellum and storm, and Eleanor Gray closed the door on ghosts. Ava Monroe said, "There is more," and the room held its breath. Eleanor said, "When you were 15, I took your memories of the first Bond flare, and the admission dented the air." Milo Park said, "You erased her," and shock stepped between devotion and anger. Eleanor said, "I spared you a lifetime of burning before you could name the flame, and guilt was honest and heavy." Ava pressed fingers to her temple and saw flashes of Damien Blackthorne in an alley, his hand cupping her panic like a fragile cup. Ava said, "You chose my path, and the grief was not simple." Eleanor said, "I chose time for you to grow teeth," and her eyes were storms that had learned manners. Celine Vale leaned in the doorway and said, "Truth hurts but lies rot, and let the silence take root." Ava said, "I forgive you with conditions," and set each word down like measured stones. Eleanor nodded, relieved and smaller and stronger all at once. The wind climbed as the tower map pulsed, and a single line of text wrote itself across the wall like a verdict. Celine Vale read, "Break the brand and one heart ceases," and the room stopped pretending to be kind. Milo Park said, "We vote no on death," and swallowed, because votes mean little to magic. Eleanor Gray said, "There may be a third path," and her voice wore doubt. Rowan Hale said, "Cost finds you even then," and did not look away from Ava. Ava Monroe said, "I will take the price if it saves him," and her pulse pounded like a drum against stone. The crescent flared, and a vision showed Damien Blackthorne, gasping as the brand drank him. Ava said, "I choose him and me together," and the rune line flickered as if surprised. Celine said, "Then we will trick the math," and a slow smile hunted options. Eleanor said, "We craft a braid that shares the wound," and hope arrived bruised but breathing. The map lifted like a living thing, and pointed to the tower crown where storms rehearsed. The blood moon heaved over the tower like a burning crown, and the city held its breath. Ava Monroe said, "This ends with us," and the crescent burned steady in her palm. Eleanor Gray said, "Braid your pulses," and chalked a final knot across stone. Milo Park said, "I hate stairs and fate," and tightened his grip on courage. Celine Vale said, "On my count the wards blink," and her pupils thinned like blades. Rowan Hale said, "I hold the flank," and regret moved behind his eyes. Thunder unstitched the clouds as sigils rose along the parapet. Ava said, "Damien, hear me," and her voice rode the wind like a thrown rope. The brand inside her wrist answered with a heavy drum. Far below, bells argued with sirens and lost. Eleanor said, "When you feel him, do not flinch," and lifted the braid into light. Celine whispered, 3, 2, now, and the ward skin thinned to pain. Ava stepped through and felt heat crawl her spine. She said, "I am not afraid of the price," and belief burned fear into fuel. The moon reddened the stones until they looked wet with prophecy. The ward spat sparks as specters lunged, and Rowan Hale met the first with a clean arc. Rowan said, "Buy your moment," and steel rang like rain in a jaw. Milo Park hurled salt and laughter, and two ghosts forgot their shapes. Celine Vale split into a blur that stitched gaps with shadow. Eleanor Gray said, "Hold the braid," and her hands shook and held anyway. Ava Monroe said, "Damien, take my breath," and the bond opened like a throat that had learned mercy. Pain came bright and righteous and found her ready. Rowan staggered as a wraith clawed his shoulder, and he stayed standing. Milo said, "We are not breakable today," and his grin convinced the air. Celine said, "Gate is thinnest now," and the clouds bent. Ava stepped toward the inner door and felt his heartbeat catch on hers. She said, "I am here," and the sigils softened to let the sentence pass. The ward hissed a promise it could not keep. The inner chamber bloomed like a cruel cathedral, and Damien Blackthorne lifted his head. Damien said, "You should not be here," and relief and terror braided his voice. Ava Monroe said, "I come where my heart lives," and the chains of light trembled. Lucian Voss stepped from the wheel and wore triumph like a tailored sin. Lucian said, "Love is a battery that never learns," and his rings clicked. Eleanor Gray stood at the threshold and would not blink. Celine Vale slid left and mapped exits with a glance. Milo Park said, "I object to this decor," and found the main sigil anchor. Ava said, "Break him from me," and power gathered like a red tide. Damien said, "No, break me free," and the brand flared hunger. Lucian said, "Choose and bleed," and the wheel drank the air. Ava touched Damien's wrist, and the brand answered to her name. She said, "We burn this chain together," and the chamber leaned closer to listen. Ava Monroe said, "Take me," and drove warmth into Damien's skin until the brand screamed. Pain staggered her, and she held because love had practice. Damien Blackthorne said, "Share not surrender," and pushed life back along the braid. Eleanor Gray said, "Braid by thirds," and cut her palm to seed the spell. Milo Park pressed his hand to the floor rune and said, "Come on, math," and grit shook. Celine Vale said, "I will carry the spill," and gathered the overload like a thief of lightning. Lucian Voss snarled and tightened the wheel until metal cried. Ava said, "I choose both hearts," and the brand split into 2 red threads. Damien said, "Stay with me," and his eyes steadied like a harbor. Rowan Hale crashed through the door and caught the blade meant for Ava's back. Rowan said, "Oh, paid," and sank to one knee with a red bloom. The chamber rattled, and the chain began to unright itself, letter by burning letter. Lucian Voss felt the chain fail and reached for the moon like a thief of tides. Lucian said, "I built this city's spine and the storm bent to his lie." Ava Monroe said, "You harvest what you cannot grow," and drew the brand threads into a knot. Damien Blackthorne pulled beside her and said, "Together," and their pulses struck true. Eleanor Gray spoke a binding that tasted of old iron and death. Milo Park yanked the anchor, and the wheel lurched and shed light like shrapnel. Celine Vale flipped the spill into the sky and starved the ritual. Rowan Hale rose bleeding and drove his sword through the wheel's heart. The room blew outward with a roar that emptied every prayer. Lucian stumbled, framed in red, and the stolen power turned on him like a pack. Ava said, "Fall," and the knot snapped, and the brand died with a soft sigh. Damien caught her as the storm folded and went quiet. The city exhaled, and the blood moon cooled by inches into mercy. Dawn bled across the tower, the city exhaled, and Ava Monroe said, "We held." Damien Blackthorne steadied her, and Rowan Hale whispered, "Debt closed," before vanishing into light. Eleanor Gray dressed his wound one last time. Milo Park muttered, "No dying today," and Celine Vale said, "Power shifts with sunrise." The tower finally felt like stone again. At noon in the Hall of Oaths, wardens pressed Eleanor Gray, and Ava Monroe said, "She took my memories, and I still choose her beside me." Damien Blackthorne vouched calm. Milo Park muttered jokes. Celine Vale whispered, "Truth is weather." Eleanor bowed to penance, and Ava said, "Walk with me, not ahead." By evening, markets reopened, Milo Park lifted bread like a medal. Ava Monroe said, "You kept us standing," and laughter softened the air. Celine Vale tossed coins to music. Eleanor Gray poured cider. Damien Blackthorne said, "Your courage is loud." Lanterns glowed, banners read "We stayed," and the square smelled alive again. Night fell soft. Ava Monroe and Damien Blackthorne walked the river. He said, "Without the brand, who are we?" She said, "Two hearts choosing." He touched her scar. She said, "Stay," and he said, "Always." Reflections floated unbroken as Milo Park called from afar, and laughter joined the quiet water. At dawn, the moon faded pale. Ava Monroe touched the crescent and said, "We are our own prophecy." Damien Blackthorne kissed her under a rising sun. Eleanor Gray set packs for teaching. Milo Park offered pastries, and Celine Vale smirked at fate. The last shadow left without complaint.